Okay, so the formula that we're going to write in is the perimeter of a rectangle. So how do you find perimeter of anything? Add all the sides. Now, a rectangle has 2 lengths and 2 widths, right? So we can say perimeter equals 2L plus 2W because the lengths are the same and the widths are the same. So this is an important that you're going to use quite a bit. So like I said, I don't know why it's not on my chart. I keep telling myself I'm going to fix it and I forget. So now another thing is if you read a word problem and you're like, oh dear Lord, I have no idea what formula I need to use. You need to go back and look at what numbers it gave you. What do those numbers represent? That's what's going to help you, okay? So looking at this first one can be a little confusing and we're going to talk it through. So it says a glacier is a giant mass of rock and ice that flows downhill like a river. Portage, I don't know, y'all. Portage Glacier in Alaska is about 6 miles or 31,680 feet long and moves 400 feet per year. Icebergs are created when the front end of the glacier flows into Portgate Lake. How long does it take for the ice at the head of the glacier to reach the lake? That was a lot of information, and if you're like me, you read that and you're like, huh? Okay, so we're going to go back and look at the numbers it gave us. It gave us 6 miles or 31,680 feet. What is 6 miles? I know, but what is it like word-wise? Like if I tell you 6 miles, what am I telling you? A distance. So we know we have a distance. Does that make sense? Technically it's a length, but lengths are distances, right? So we know we have a distance. Okay? And then it says 400 feet per year. What's that? It's not a time, it's a rate because it's per year. Anytime you see per, okay, it's going to be some kind of rate because it's telling you it does this feet per year. So that's the rate it's happening. So if we have a distance and we have a rate and then it tells us how long does it take, isn't that time? Well, if you look, distance equals rate times time. Is that all the things that we just talked about? So is that probably the formula we're going to use? Yes, so we know distance equals rate times time. And what is our distance? 6 miles. Now here's my question. What's my rate?
400.
400 what? Feet per year. So which distance should I use? 6 miles or 31,680 feet? Yes, because it says feet and this says feet, we need to keep feet. Because if we do miles and feet, it's not going to be an accurate answer. Okay? So we're going to use the 31,680 equals, and what's my rate? 400, right? 400 feet per year. Times time. Well, time is what we're trying to find. We're trying to find time. So we don't know time. Well, this is simple to solve. How do I solve this?
Divide by 400.
Divide both sides by 400. Because how do you get rid of multiplication? You divide. If you're like me, you look at that and you're like, yeah, I'm not doing that in my head. 31680 divided by 400. And what's my answer? 79.2. So I get time equals 79.2 what? 79.2 what? No. Time. Time equals years because it's feet per year. So this is years. Any questions with that? Okay, now what if this was multiple choice? Y'all, I don't care if you leave it as a decimal, but what if it was multiple choice and some of the answers were like 79 years and 6 days, 79 years and 100 days? How would you know? Well, it's already not rounded, but it's already at the nearest tenth, but how would you know how many days that 0.2 represents? Do y'all know how to find that? What you can do is you can take your decimal, so 0.2 times 365, because how many days are in a year? 365. So if you do 0.2 times 365, how many days is it going to be? 73. So it's 79 years and 73 days. Now, most of the time, I let you leave it as a decimal, especially during these types of problems, but it's always good to know how to change it. So you just take your decimal place and multiply it by whatever that total is. So like, what if we were talking about time? How many minutes is in an hour? 60. So you would take your decimal and multiply by 60. Does that make sense? So it depends on what kind of time you're talking about. If we're talking about years, 365 days in a year, and it's that conversion. Does that make sense? Any questions with that? Okay, so let's look at number 2. This is my bad. I don't know what happened with my formatting here. It should just be 77 degrees. Not 77, 77, 77. I don't know what that is. Okay, so it says the average minimum temperature for July in Shanghai, China is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Find the equivalent temperature in degrees Celsius. So obviously we're going to use this formula, right? For degrees Fahrenheit and Celsius. Now, does it matter which one you use, whether it's a fraction or a decimal? No, a lot of times y'all prefer the decimal because it's just simpler to type in your calculator. So we will do Fahrenheit equals 1.8 Celsius plus 32. And what's given to me? My Fahrenheit. What is my Fahrenheit? So I'm going to replace F with 77. And what am I going to solve for? C. So just a reminder, we always get rid of our addition and subtraction that's next to our term that has what we're solving for. So how do I get rid of plus 32? So I'm going to subtract 32 from both sides. And that gives me 77 minus 32 is 45. So I have 45 equals 1.8 Celsius. Now what's my last step? Divide both sides by 1.8. And what did you say that equals? 25. 25 what?
Celsius.
Degrees Celsius. So make sure with word problems you always need to label your answers. Okay? There are very, very few. Like I know on, if you remember 5.1, there was one that was like the 2 diagonal doors. Okay, well, you don't really need to label room numbers, right? It's just numbers. But for the most part, everything that we're doing today needs to be labeled. At 1 point. Okay, look at number 3. Number 3 says the length of a rectangular road sign. So right away I'm talking about rectangle. Okay, is 2 feet less than 3 times its width. Find the dimensions if the perimeter is 28 feet. So before I even, because I always read it fast first, but it sounds like a lot when we do that. So what stood out to me is perimeter and rectangle. How do you find the perimeter of a rectangle? P equals 2L plus 2W. So I know I'm using P equals 2L plus 2W. And I have 3 unknowns here. So I know I need to find at least 2 of them to solve. Those are my 3 unknowns. You don't always have to do this, but sometimes it helps when they're confusing like this. What do I know without having to use any math? The perimeter is 28. You're right too, but that one was like the easy one. Okay, then it tells me the length of a rectangular road sign. So my length is 2 feet less. What does that mean? Subtract what? I know I'm going to subtract 2 from something. Then 3 times its width. Yeah, I'm going to multiply 3 times my width. I don't know my width, so I just use W. When I do word problems, y'all, I don't really like using X and Y because I know I want to use letters that represent what I'm solving for, because then it's less confusing. If I use X and Y, I'm like, oh crud, which one was length, which one was width? It gets confusing. So if I use W and L, I know exactly which one's which. So I know length, if I write this proper, my variable goes first, 3W minus 2. And then it doesn't tell me anything about width. So I remember, I only need to know 2 things to solve. So I'm going to plug in perimeters 28. And then my length is 3W minus 2 plus 2W. Now, I always know I've plugged in correctly when I have the same letter that's there. So aren't both of my letters W? That's the same, so now I can solve for W. First things first when we're solving is we always want to simplify both sides. Well, 28 is obviously simplified. What am I going to do on that right side to simplify? I'm going to multiply, I'm going to distribute. So what's 2 times 3W? And then 2 times negative 2. And what do I do with this plus 2W? Yeah, just bring it down. I'm not multiplying it because it was outside the parentheses. Is it fully simplified yet? No, what can still simplify? Not yet. I want to simplify the right side first before I start moving things. Yeah, 6W plus 2W are like terms. So I'm going to combine those. What's 6 plus 2?
8W.
So now I have 8W minus 4. Now what am I going to do with that 4? Add 4 to both sides. I want to make sure both sides are fully simplified before I start moving things because it can get really confusing if I start moving things before they're simplified. So this gives me 32 equals 8W. Now what? Divide by 8. And what does W equal? 4. So I know my width. So now I need to go back and figure out what my question is asking me. It says find the dimensions. Well, dimensions means length and width. Length and width. Well, what do I already know? My width. What's my width? 4 what? So 4 feet. How do I find my length? Well, don't I know length is 3W minus 2? And I know W is 4, so can I plug it in and solve? Yeah, so I know length is 3W minus 2, and I'm going to plug in 3 times 4 minus 2. You could type that in your calculator, but y'all, what's 3 times 4 minus 2? So did you really need a calculator? 10 what? Feet. So there are your dimensions. You can also see dimensions written 4 feet by 10 feet. So either of those are accepted. As long as you have both, I'm happy. So that one was kind of the gross one. But for the most part, these are pretty simple. Now, if you look at the back, we call these literal equations. Do not let them stress you out. You're literally just rearranging, okay? That's all you're doing. Now, why am I not actually solving for something? Well, it's because you don't know what all the letters equal. So we can't simplify like we normally can. Like here, we can simplify because we know what 2 of the things equal. But if you look on the back, literal equations, we're just rearranging because we don't know what any of this equals. So if we want it to equal L, we're solving for L. Well, this is V equals L times W times H, right? When there's no symbol, it's multiplying. How do you get rid of multiplication? Divide. What am I trying to get rid of? The W and the H. So divide WH, divide WH. Division and multiplication cancel each other, so those cancel. Do I have L by itself now on the right? I'm going to rewrite it on the left. I always rewrite my L's capital because if you're like me, they start to look like ones, and then it gets confusing. And I'm left with V over WH. Does anything simplify? No, so there's your answer. Do you see what I mean as we just rearranged? All we did was move things to the other side to get L by itself. Do not let it stress you out. Okay, so there are different things, like that one was pretty simple. The other ones are all pretty similar. So if we're solving perimeter of a rectangle for width, you could, but I'm going to do that second. So first thing I always like to tell y'all is this is the term that has what I'm solving for, right? I need to get that term alone. So what do I need to get rid of? 2L. How do I get rid of 2L? Subtract, because it's being added. So minus 2L, and I get P minus 2L equals 2W. Now that this term is alone, how do I get W by itself? Divide. Now what you do to one term, you have to do to all terms. So I'm going to separate all 3 terms, and I'm going to put a 2 in the bottom. This cancels. Is W now by itself? Yes. And we get P over 2, which doesn't simplify, but what happens here? These 2's cancel as well, and you get minus L. Now, Kayla, you weren't wrong. You could have divided by 2 first. I just want to stick with the same steps over and over and over again, so that way it doesn't get confusing. But you would have gotten the same answer. Any questions with those two? Okay, so following those same steps, let's look at example 6. So I'm going to find the term. I'm solving for t, and that's in this term. So what term do I need to get moved? The p. How do I move that p? So I'm going to do minus p minus p. I get a minus p equals PRT. Now all I have left is multiplication. How do we get rid of multiplication? Divide all 3 terms by PR. Is T now by itself? Yes, so we did it correctly. And I have A over PR minus, what happens here? The P's cancel, and what's left? But where is that R? On the bottom, so guess where it has to stay? On the bottom. What can I put on top to make this a 1? Proper. I feel like I have to write my 1 like that so it doesn't look confusing. But that's your answer. Now, I do want to show you something that is a common mistake. Do not write this down, but I want you to see this. Something I see a lot, because this isn't wrong, I'm going to rewrite this step right here. So A minus P equals PRT. When you divide, you don't technically have to separate all 3 terms. You can do this side, okay? And I'm dividing by PR, PR. So I get T by itself. But what happens in this step if you don't separate is a lot of times people will cancel P. But is that right? No, because the A should still have a P on the bottom. So if you notice that nothing's going to simplify, it's okay if you write it as a single fraction. I'm just going to always tell you to separate, because if you do this, you're wrong. You see what I'm saying? So just always separate your fractions so that way you don't ever have that issue. Okay? Last one. What do I need to do first? Subtract 32 from both sides, because this is my term that has my C. And F minus 32 do not combine, so they just become neighbors. 9 over 5C. Now, I know that I taught y'all the other day that you can get rid of a fraction in 1 step by multiplying by the reciprocal, right? And you can technically do that here. Sometimes it's easier to do it 1 step at a time, but we can do both. We're going to use our calculator. So how do I get rid of 9 over 5? By 5 over 9. The reciprocal, right? Because the 5's cancel and the 9's cancel. However, I need to multiply this side also by 5 over 9. So if I do 5 over 9 times F, I get 5F over 9, or 5 over 9F, it doesn't matter. And then if I do 5 over 9 times negative 32, this is where your calculator becomes your best friend. 5 over 9 times negative 32. I get negative 160 over 9 equals C. I don't know if y'all remember, but when multiplying, you can make these both fractions. It's just top times top, bottom times bottom. Okay. I want you to realize, though, that because nothing simplified here, if this was multiple choice, you could see your answer like this as a single fraction, because the denominators are still the same. Yes? So just know that if the denominators didn't change like it did in our other ones, you could see it as a single fraction. Okay? Any questions? Okay, so the big thing I want you to remember here is don't forget perimeter. Oh my goodness. This is why I don't teach English. Perimeter of a rectangle is P equals 2L plus 2W. You can use that. Please use that, because it's used on like 3 of them.